Hello everyone, this is the next round of my work tournament, round 3. Thought I'd share with you guys how I went. Let's see how I went, hey? So my opponent went e4 and I was black, so I played the knight f6 to counter attack, and it turns into a Scandinavian defense where it's very counter attacking. So my opponent played pawn to e5. Now you can retreat the knight if you want, which would be a perfectly good move, but say I retreated the knight back, this could turn to some sort of French defense, blocked up center, which I didn't really care for. I decided to counter attack. So now we're at this standoff where both knights are threatened at the same time. Who's going to blink first? Well, my opponent doesn't blink, he captures my knight, and I capture his knight. Now we're at such a funny position where we've got pawns, all developed as pawns, and they're on opposite sides of the board. And now my opponent can capture in 4 different ways. He can capture my c3 pawn with either of those 2 pawns, and he could capture my g7 pawn, or he could capture my e7 pawn, or he could make another move. He decides to capture towards the center, which is the correct move. It allows for a d4, and you don't mind weakening your pawns or doubling them if you can capture towards the center. Okay, now I just violated my rule. I said that to capture towards the center. In this case, you could capture towards the center. However, seeing as though I'm planning on castling kingside, I didn't really want an open file opposite my king. So in this case, because I wanted my king on the king side, I took away from the center to keep my pawns intact. So there's general rules, and then there's other general rules, and so you got to work out which one. This is why chess is a game of, I guess, skill. You can decide. This is why it's such a fun game. You get to decide which rule you want to follow and which rules you want to try and break and get away with, don't you? So let's see. So d4, good move, taking control of the center and allowing for development of both bishops. My opponent's playing really well, strong player. I developed my bishop to this square, which is just, as I said, I wanted to castle kingside quickly, so I wanted to get my pieces out on the king side, and this square is good for the bishop as it's got a nice diagonal attacking down this way, and it also attacks down this way. Notice too that with my pawn on f6 here and my bishop here, it makes it a little bit difficult for my opponent to develop his dark squared bishop in an aggressive manner. So he can't really come here and aggressive. f4's covered, these squares are all covered, so this bishop can only really come to the d2 square or the e3 square, which is more of a defensive posting. So I decided to take control of this straight away. Knight out, castle, bishop d3. Okay. Now I decided to throw a check in while I key in before he's castled. So if he moves the king, he's lost the right to castle, and that's not very good. If he moves the bishop back, he's just wasted a move moving forward and back. The knight can't come up because of my pawn. This pawn's actually a good controller of a central square here, e5. So the only move my opponent can do is play the bishop in front, which is what they did. Now I decided to bring some more pieces out, so I didn't want to bring the knight to c6, which is a normal move, because my opponent's pawns here restrict my knight from moving there, there, or there. So my knight can't move to any of those squares, it would have to go down to here. So I decided to bring it to a more flexible square, which is knight to d7. Now I could either go to b6 and target these 2 squares here, or I could go over to the king side. Opponent castled, and I decided to move my knight over to the king side and potentially go for a king side attack. My opponent grabs the open file. Again, another good move. Now it's hard for me to develop my bishop here. If I try to pin his knight or anything, I'm going to lose the pawn. So I decided to get my knight up and potentially jump into the f4 square, threatening the bishop, targeting the g2 square, and then who knows, maybe I can have some sort of kingside attack later. Bring the queen maybe potentially up and across. These are all, you know, love to have, but let's see what happens. Boom, there goes the knight. Change of plans. Now I take the bishop, and now look at this ridiculous pawn structure here. Got 4 pawns here, doubled pawns. Makes it hard for me to do a kingside attack, as I'm going to have difficulty getting some pieces over to the king side as my pawns are in the way. For example, you can't really normally bring a rook up and across or anything, because I'd have to move the 2 pawns, and then it's not very good. On the other hand, they do provide, I guess, a bit of a shield. I've got 4 pawns in front of my king, so my opponent also can't really bring pieces up. Look, the squares they control, these 4 pawns are here. So you've got these pawns control those 4, and those 2 pawns control those 4 squares. So I've got these 8 squares shield in front of my king. So my opponent will find it hard to attack my king also. So play will have to be happening somewhere else. My opponent identifies this correctly and starts advancing in the center. My opponent has a stronger center than me, as I only have 1 pawn in the center. He technically has 3. So my opponent is playing very well, advancing where he is strong. Again, pushing my bishop back. My bishop's now been pushed back, but I'd like to bring my queen in front, so I've got some sort of attacking ideas. Opponent brings the rook up to centralize the rook, potentially looking to bring the rook over to the center and then push the center pawn. I play queen c7, setting up queen bishop battery on h2. So now my opponent's knight is paralyzed. If he moves the knight, it's checkmate. So I'm just restricting this piece here. My opponent plays in the center. Now, I thought about this for a while, and my response is I have to take. If the pawn gets to 1 more square further on, my bishop and queen will be very blocked in, and then it will be very hard for me to move. I'll be getting squashed. So I have to take. Queen takes. Now, the move I played was to play bishop to e6, because I saw that I could skewer the queen and rook and win an exchange, which is what I played. The computer actually, when analysing this later, doesn't like this move. It actually prefers to go for a kingside attack with the pawns and potentially push up again, threatening checkmate. So if I move this pawn 1 more square and that knight has to move, it's checkmate. So my opponent would have to play this move, and then it goes for threatening the queen moves, and then it wants to play f5, queen to a4, bishop to threaten the queen to b4, g4. This is how the computer wants me to play. It wants me to go for a pawn storm with my extra pawns. Take, and now I've got the checkmate threat, and I'm threatening the knight. This game is actually winning now for me. I decided to go for material instead, and my opponent played a tricky move, queen to e4, which actually pins my bishop. So I can't take the exchange, or I lose this rook with check, and then once I move my king out of the way, my opponent captures my bishop back, winning a piece. So I had to play f5 to dislodge this pin. If I can dislodge the pin, then I can win the exchange. My opponent can't come to e5 because I've got that defended, and he can't move back along to e5 because he's blocked in by his own bishop. So queen to h4. Now, I took the rook. What I had to calculate was, if I take the rook, what happens if knight here? Let's go through it. Knight here, threatening a devastating check, or a not so devastating check. Well, in this case, I have 2 options. One, I can ignore the threat and just let it happen. Check, there, take. Now it looks like my opponent's got a bit of an attack going, but what you might not have noticed is it's my move. Checkmate. Yeah, don't forget about this sneaky move. So my opponent can't get the queen and knight off defending this square, so with only 2 pieces and not being able to leave the h file, this attack is not very good, and I'd end up a piece up. So I took the rook, and my opponent took it back correctly. So now I've just won an exchange. Next phase of the game. We've got 6 pawns each. I've got only 2 pawns against 3 on the queen side, so my opponent will try and push these pawns up and create a pass pawn to distract me. I decided to play f6 to just eliminate any knight jumps and control the center. It does leave me open down this diagonal, but I have a queen that can cover. So c4, queen covers, so my queen and pawns are defending my king really well. It's time to get the bishop out, rook out, and get all my pieces into the game. So you'll notice me going for this. So my opponent tries to attack down on the king side. Still no threats, keep developing. f4. Alright, now, I guess a proper move would be to bring the bishop back. Say here, for example. Keep your pieces. You want to keep your pieces on your side of the board where they're all protected. It's protected by the queen, and everything's nice and defended. But I saw a sneaky trap and decided to set it for my opponent, who was getting very low on time. So I moved the bishop to b2. And normally this is not a good idea because you've got a piece all out on its own. It could get forked somehow, it could get attacked and getting driven away, for example. Something like this. Yeah, I gotta go there, then it wins a pawn, for example. So it's normally not a good idea to do that. But in this case, I just saw a sneaky trap. My opponent played queen to g3, which is, if you go back, I was thinking about my opponent's plan. He's played knight to h4, and he'd love to go queen to g3 to attack my pawn, but he can't because my bishop's here. So he went f4 with the idea of moving the bishop and then playing queen g3 to take on g6 and then have an attack going on my king. So I was anticipating queen g3, which my opponent played. Okay, now it's your turn. You can pause the video if you want. Find the winning move right now, which caused my opponent to resign. Well, the move was rook takes e3. A simple sacrifice, which isn't really a sacrifice. At this point, my opponent resigned because the queen takes rook. The reason I kept this bishop on this diagonal is now clear. If it was here, it couldn't have done this move. Bishop to d4 skewers the queen, pins the queen and wins the queen. So my opponent resigned. My opponent doesn't take the rook and decides to move the queen, for example. Simple trade, and I'm now up a rook with a winning position. So I hope you enjoyed this game. It was a fun game for me, and it got down to very low time, so it was pretty exciting. I'll see you guys with the next round.